Ferrari underlined the performance we saw on Friday by taking the pole for the Australian Grand Prix. Charles Leclerc, absolutely superb in the closing minutes of Q3. Not so lucky for his teammate Carlos Sainz, who had looked very quick all weekend. Quick yesterday, very, very sharp this morning as well in FP3. But Carlos delayed in the garage in Q3 with some starter motor problem. Incredible that in cars as sophisticated as these, that something as innocuous as a starter motor should mess up his qualifying like that. But he went out, and this was a day when it was very important to get a good outlap to get the right sort of temperature into the tyres, maybe even 2 outlaps to get everything absolutely au point. And of course, he was unable to do that in the dying moments of Q3. So he put in a banker lap, and the pole went to Charles Leclerc. But it wasn't as clear-cut as you may think, because Max Verstappen had looked very, very quick in his first run in Q3, right up until the second last corner. His bête noire at this circuit so far. Yesterday he looked terrible through there, had lots of understeering moments. He had an oversteering moment there this morning. A messy morning, got to say, or FP3 for Max. He was out on medium tyres. Everybody else was on the soft. He couldn't get temperature into the medium. He had no grip. And he just lost the back end in a slow speed spin at this second last corner, this tight left-hander. And then in Q3 on a really good lap, and it would have been somewhere near the pole lap, probably. He was quickest in Sector 1, quickest in Sector 2. He just locked up into that second last corner and lost the lap. But it wasn't lost, it was an 18.3, which was the same time as his teammate Sergio Perez, but it meant an 18.1 in the second part of Q3, not quite enough to beat the brilliant Charles Leclerc. Going back to Ferrari, it was interesting, I thought, to see Charles, or to hear Charles on his outlap in that final run. I want to be behind Carlos. Of course he does. The track's slightly quicker if you're out later. Plus, he might be able to get some sort of tow through that double DRS section round the back. And he was cruising around, putting temperature into the tyres, and suddenly said, "Where is Carlos?" And at that moment, of course, came the message on the radio saying that Carlos was still in the garage with an issue. We now know that issue was a starter motor issue, and they couldn't get the car fired up. And obviously, totally unsurprisingly, Carlos Sainz was incredibly annoyed afterwards. Frustrated, I guess is the word, because this was a Carlos driving beautifully, very, very polished, lovely turn into the new turn 1. If it was him or Charles, you couldn't tell the difference. Just fabulous turn in. More supple turn in than I've ever seen Carlos really over the last, ever since he's been around in Formula 1, since the Toro Rosso days. Really, really good. It looked completely in harmony with the car. And if that time was there to be done by Charles Leclerc, it for sure would have been equaled by Carlos, I think, today. If not, maybe surpassed by a fraction. That's not to detract from Charles Leclerc. It's just that sort of circuit. I think there's not enough now to define the characteristics of the very, very good racing drivers. And in a good car, Carlos Sainz was always going to be right up there with Charles around Melbourne. But it was Charles who took the pole. And I suppose the other interesting thing is how quick the Ferrari was over the lap and how slow it is still through the speed traps. Let's have a look at them. Sergio Perez 320, Max Verstappen 318 in that final run in Q3. Charles Leclerc 312, so a big difference. And also interestingly, a lot more bouncing on the Ferrari as well on the going into turns 9, 10. And that obviously is an indication of how much more downforce these guys are carrying on the F1 75 Ferrari, and how much less downforce they're running on the Red Bull Honda. So in terms of an overall package of not having a car that bounces when you want to make it really quick, you've got to say Red Bull at the moment have the more favourable package. But in terms of a race car that in theory is drivable, manageable, and does the lap in a very harmonious way, in other words, it doesn't rely on a lot of top speed, it's just really good in all conditions, the Ferrari is your car. So it's going to be interesting. Christian Horner was saying after Q3 that potentially the bouncing on the Ferrari might have an impact on its tyre management and the way it uses its tyres. And that's a good point. And it should also be made that in the DRS zone, when the DRS is activated, it appears that the bouncing is slightly less. So if, for example, Charles is in the toe of Max in the early stages of the race, that might help him in terms of time management. But that's a little bit of a spurious point, because I think it would still be better for Charles to be in front. I think he'd prefer, if you gave him the two options, he'd still prefer to be in front. But there's another issue here. And that is the physical effect of that bouncing as well on the drivers. We don't talk about that very much, but it's very, very high velocity. And when you see, for example, in the Mercedes, which is both getting really bad bouncing still, and Ferrari too at that point, and some others as well, when you see cockpit, how much those guys are moving and how little suspension there is in the car, zero, you start to think, over a long period of time, this is not going to be good for the physiology of the drivers who are subjected to it to a great extent. So that's something else to bear in mind. Probably not a fatigue issue in terms of the Grand Prix tomorrow, but certainly something that the FIA should be looking at, I think, as time goes on. And speaking of top speeds, I was very pleased to see that the FIA stewards or whoever were watching yesterday's video, because they've now removed one of the two DRS zones around the back that I was speaking about yesterday. I'm only joking, of course they didn't watch the video. Well, they might have, who knows. But nonetheless, I think it's great that they've taken away the first of those two DRS zones around the back. Yesterday it was DRS from sort of 7 down to turn 9, and then again the back end of that sector. But now that's gone, and there's only one DRS zone at the back, and I think that's a very good thing. For the reasons I said, we don't need cars this big, this powerful, this quick, on curved bits of road, flat out in 8th gear, helped by DRS, sitting on one another's tail and doing weird things. And I think that's a great thing. And beyond that, of course, there was also the question of when the DRS was activated, if you've got a really bad car, was that section of road flat anyway? And which brings to mind, I was talking to Peter Wright the other day, and I think if you haven't seen the video, he talks about the way porpoising and bouncing arrived in the ground effect era in 1978, 79, 80. And we were chatting after that video about the Lotus 80, which was the full ground effect version of the Lotus 79. They decided, well, 79 is good, but let's do a really long ground effect car. And it had to have curved skirts by definition. And one of the reasons it never really works was the curved skirts kept getting stuck. Well, you called it a test day at Silverstone with Mario Andretti in the 80, and porpoising and bouncing had occurred, but only with Mario's description. They didn't know what was going on. And this was, of course, long before onboard cameras had been invented, and it wasn't considered safe for obvious reasons to put a camera on the car. So they got Mario, they wired him up to sound to describe the lap of Silverstone as the porpoising occurred on the Lotus 80. And when they were playing back afterwards, Mario came into the motorhome and said, "Did you get all that?" And Peter Wright said, "Yeah, we got it all, Mario." And he said, "Do you understand what I'm talking about?" And Peter said, "Well, yeah, when you were describing how the front wheels of the car were actually coming off the ground, the porpoising was so bad down Hanger Straight. I'll repeat that, the front wheels of the Lotus 80 actually coming off the ground in a straight line when it was porpoising. Yeah, we got it then, Mario." Mario gave him the thumbs up and left the debrief room. Anyway, yeah, let's get back to 2022 and the porpoising, which still continues. So Charles Leclerc on the pole, Max Verstappen 18-1, so it was 0.3 of a second in the end, and you could say there was a 0.3 advantage for Red Bull in a straight line, and yet that was more than lost around effectively sectors 1 and 2. Sergio Perez, very good job, P3, a little bit more fuel in the car. He was planning to do a longer run, get the tyres in, but that all kind of went away with a red flag that came out in the middle of the session. Thanks to I was going to say thanks to Fernando Alonso, but you shouldn't really thank him because it was more an Alpine, well, it was an Alpine issue. Fernando, got to say here, press pause, let's do a Fernando Alonso section, because Fernando, on his outlap in the beginning of Q3, and let's just go back to where he was in Q2. Fernando P5 in Q2, really impressive. 18.6 Max Verstappen, Fernando Alonso 18.8, and he'd been really quick in a straight line all weekend as well. As we said yesterday, the Alpine looking really good around here. And Fernando was on a brilliant lap. He was P2 in Sector 1, second only to Charles Leclerc. He was purple in Sector 2. And then going into the beginning of Sector 3, the quick right-hander, he's going down through the gears and suddenly everything just stops. Lost hydraulics, lost the gearing, lost the steering as well, steering very heavy, and crunched the wall. And that brought the red flag out. And that's what affected, of course, the dynamic of the Sergio Perez qualifying as well in terms of how much fuel he had in the car. There was also a slight glitch for Sergio, and he's under investigation at the moment with the stewards as to whether or not he backed off enough when a yellow came out, when I think it was George Russell went down an escape road just momentarily, and apparently the Red Bull telemetry shows that he backed off, but the question of course is whether he backed off enough. So watch, well, I don't watch this space, but I'll try and keep it up to date on the description below the video. Something else I should say here now before this all gets too complicated, because qualifying is complicated, trying to condense it all into a relatively small space of time. Q2, to some extent, was characterized by the setting sun in the west, obviously. And there's quite a lot of the lap where the drivers were looking, at the moment Q2 was taking place, directly into the sun. We're talking sort of Futa Pass, Stirling Moss, 1955, Mille Miglia stuff here. Actually, we're talking a very young P. Windsor marshalling at Warwick Farm in Australia. And one of my earliest memories is of Leo Gagan, fabulous racing driver, in a Lotus 27, I think it was, coming into my corner, Paddock Bend, with his left hand on the steering wheel and his right hand like this, just against the sun. You know, Aussie race drivers were used to that, mate. Yeah, it happens all the time. But here's a question. There was a big panic after this, and everybody wanted to go to dark visors for Q3. I raised 2 points about that. One, dark visors may be a help when you're looking into the sun, but the long sun, the long shadows at that time of the day in Australia would make it even worse with a dark visor, I would have thought, on the dark side of the circuit. So that was, I don't know how that worked out in the end, but I don't think that was the real solution. The real solution is, why did they drop these? Here's Ronnie Peterson with a peak on his full-face helmet. This is 1978, I think. And and it looks cool. It's good enough for Ronnie Peterson. I'm sorry, it's good enough for everybody else. Why did they stop having peaks on helmets? Maybe it was an aerodynamic thing. You know, they do so much work around the airflow now. But, airflow versus being able to see in Q2 when the sun's shining. I'm not saying a peak would necessarily solve the problem, but it would be worth trying. It'd be interesting to see if any helmet manufacturers do come up with this as an option now, whether the fashion will be back. The peak that Ronnie had a lip on it, but to have one that came down a little bit further, perhaps, would be quite good. But then, of course, you've also got the visibility issue of the whole halo thing. So how that comes into play and any shadows that casts as well, I suppose that has to be taken into account. Anyway, that was the main thing of Q2. I suppose the other thing I should say, while we're going off on all these little side issues, is the shambles at Aston Martin. What a drama that was. Both guys hit the wall, and Sebastian, after the mechanics had worked, I don't know how long, to get the engine changed on that car from yesterday. And, just a complete shambles. And then we had the two Canadians, both of whom are over budgeted, running into one another at the beginning of Q1. And you just wonder what that team, Aston, would be like with that amount of money, or so the facility, the weight, the whole momentum behind the team now, if they had, some really quick guys in there. Anyway, that's another story. But it was just, Dennis Jenkinson always used to have a Team Shambles award. He usually went to BRM. I think he gave to BRM in perpetuity towards the end. But certainly, he would have given it to Aston Martin here, even before the race has been run. So, let's just go back to Q3. Lando Norris, absolutely superb, I thought, 18.7 in the McLaren. So let's get on to Mercedes now, because Mercedes overnight appeared to me, maybe completely wrong here, but they appeared to me to take some downforce out of the car, which has made it a bit more skittish everywhere. They've still got bouncing, but they've got a sort of compromised car. I think they call it an aggressive car, an aggressive setup. So they live with some of the bouncing, a bit like the Ferrari drivers, but they've got a car that's a bit more drivable, and they can put the power down with it and take advantage of the talent of these two guys they've got, Lewis Hamilton and George Russell. And it was a better car today. There were quite a lot of incidents. instance where Lewis or George would run out of road, or they have an oversteer or an understeer, and the car was a bit squirrely, but both of them were good enough to get a lap time out of it. So then we suddenly found ourselves in a position where it was Mercedes factory team against McLaren Mercedes. And guess who won that one? McLaren Mercedes, thanks to the brilliant Lando Norris. Absolutely superb lap, 18.7, really, really good. Lewis, right at the end, got a good lap in without any issues, it appears, 18.8. So there's the difference. Okay, you got to say Lewis is probably a slightly quicker driver than Lando, but there's the difference. The McLaren is a better car with the same engine. So Zach Brown will be very pleased with that one. George Russell, 18.9. So there's a big scrap all piling up between those guys. Three English drivers, interestingly, for fourth, fifth, and sixth place on the grid, and that'll be stand back, I think. And there's Daniel Ricciardo, P7, 19.0. Yeah, pretty good. 3/10 off Lando in his home Grand Prix. A lot of build-up around Daniel. There's even a bridge with his name on it. I don't think they never did that for Nigel Mansell at Silverstone, did they? Or Jim Clark, for that matter. But yeah, there's Daniel. Yeah, did a good job. He wasn't that far off the pace, and he's in top 10. And if he has a good race tomorrow with strategy, keeps out of trouble, which he probably will from that position, then he's looking at a reasonable result tomorrow, hopefully, from the Australian fan point of view. But the thought remains, as you watch the demeanour of Sergio Perez, who now is routinely qualifying top 3 and getting the odd pole and going really well, you think, if this guy had never left Red Bull in the first place and had just bitten the bullet and been Max Verstappen's teammate, yeah, okay, Max probably would have won the championship last year and not Daniel. But, Daniel by now would have won a few more races. And here in the front of the Australian crowd, he might have been P2, because this wasn't a great weekend for Max. He's looked as good as Sergio, but no better than Sergio all weekend. A bit scrappier, made more mistakes actually. And in that situation, Daniel probably would have been ahead of Max on the grid. Might have been P2, might have even gotten the pole. Anyway, just a thought. Not many people, we live in the moment. He's now a McLaren driver, and the Daniel merch is out there. But remember, this guy could be at Red Bull still, when he isn't. He chose not to. Esteban Ocon, yeah, just underline really the pace of the Alpine P9, and Carlos Sainz for P8, and Carlos Sainz, Paul Carlos P9. That's just ridiculous. There's a phrase that's come out in a lot of sports commentary, not necessarily Formula One. That's not where he wanted to be, or that's not where he planned to be this morning, or whatever. That's certainly the case with Carlos. But I thought it was quite interesting when he did put in quite a quick lap, but he finished the lap just as the red came out from the Fernando shunt. And so that lap was disallowed. I have to say, I don't know what that lap was, but I'm assuming it would have put him top 4 or 5. And we were on board Carlos as that moment happened, and you saw the red flag display come up. But then underneath, there's another display, and it says, "Stay positive." I thought that was pretty good. I don't know what it is about Latino drivers. I remember Carlos Reutemann, 81 Dutch Grand Prix. He was so impressed. I think he'd just spoken to a journalist from L'Equipe about Walter Roll's win in the Rally of Portugal and how quick, I think it was 80 or 81, I don't know. Don't hold me to it. But how quick a Roll had been on a specific stage, which was nothing. It was Argonal or something like that. It was absolute fog. And he'd been like 7 minutes quicker than anybody else. Just brilliant in fog, which, Carlos just thought was the most amazing thing. And he put that word, Argonal, the name of the rally stage, on the center of his steering wheel on the Williams FW07. And it's a bit like, stay positive. Yeah, I think Carlos is a pretty positive guy. I suppose there's that sort of slightly, fiery temperament that comes in sometimes. And we saw it a bit after qualifying today, he's just angry because things went wrong. They shouldn't happen. Well, they do happen, And Carlos, actually, the mistakes Carlos makes sometimes as a racing driver are no more or worse or better than the mistakes made somewhere along the line with this starter motor issue. So, yeah, you've got to take the rough with the smooth, Carlos. So, yeah, Red Bull go into the race tomorrow with a significant top speed advantage. Ferrari go into the race with a really good drivable race car, but with more bouncing than the Red Bulls. And they don't have their full armoury there because Charles here and Carlos is there, and you've got the 2 Red Bulls, P2 and P3. Big fight, I think, between McLaren and Mercedes and Alpine. Got to throw them in there as well. Fernando will be charging up, in theory, I would imagine, assuming they can get all that hydraulics sorted. Reliability is something we don't talk about that much, but that's something we need to consider. Because, these things are important. So there we are, Australian Grand Prix tomorrow, Albert Park. See you then.